Okay, let me start today's event. It's nice to meet all of you today. My name is Soyeon and I'm a host for today's event. And let me introduce the speaker for today. Dr. Jinhyun Cho is a lecturer in the Department of Linguistics at Macquarie University in Sydney. And she's the author of English Language Ideologies in Korea, Interpreting the Past and Present, which provides a comprehensive account of the relationship between the English language and issues of power in South Korea. So it's such an honor to have her as our speaker today for someone who has done extensive range of work in the field. Let's just give her a really warm welcoming applause, everyone. So she will now start her presentation for the next half an hour, next 30 minutes, and there will be a question time Q&A session after that. So if you have any questions, please leave them until after the talk so she can answer them as much as our time is allowed. Okay, would you like to start your talk, Dr. Jinhyun Cho?
Yes, certainly, Soyeon. Share my screen. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Soyeon. I really appreciate that. It's my pleasure to see all of you for my talk about English Fever, Language Capital, and American Dreams in South Korea. So in the presentation, I'd like to show how the popularity of English in Korea is tied to American hegemony on the peninsula. If you follow Korean news, you should know that Korea has a new president. And President-elect Mr. Yoon, he has proposed moving the presidential office from Jongno, which is the northern part of Seoul, to the southern part of Seoul in Yongsan. And the move has been controversial for many reasons in terms of feasibility, financial cost, and whatnot. But what attracted my attention was not about them, but about the way that he envisages the move. And he said that he would like to make the new presidential office based with the White Office as a model. So he wants to make it as accessible as the White Office is to the public. And, as you can see on the right-hand side, this is the vision, new vision for the presidential office. But it seems like in the Korean media, there isn't much discussion about, why it's the White House, that's regarded as a role model for the new presidential office. And this is the key point one of the key points that I would like to highlight. So why is it so natural to follow American practices in Korea? And here's another example to show how the US is seen in Korean consciousness. So you are looking at pictures of ultra-conservative Koreans, and which is called a Korean Flag Group, which is a kind of funny name, but it consists of mostly elderly people, ultra-conservative, and what's really interesting about them is whenever they have rallies and protests, they bring not just the Korean flag, but the stars and stripes, right? So why the stars and stripes in Korean rallies? And it's because in their consciousness, the US is a protector of Korea. So I'm going to show you how American hegemony has been established in Korea. So what is American hegemony? It refers to economic, military, and political dependence of Korea on the US since the division of the peninsula in 1945. And there are specific Korean terms to highlight American hegemony. The first of which is pro-America, or 친미 in Korean. It indicates positive feelings and attitudes toward the US, its culture and people. And another term is sungmi, which means worship the US, and it refers to near blind love for the US. Whatever American, whatever is the best. So English fever is strongly tied to the ongoing American hegemony in Korean society. I'm sure that a lot of you who are here, you have heard of English fever in Korea. So for Koreans, it's only natural to learn English. And English fever refers to heated pursuit of English in Korean society. And I'm going to take 3 examples to highlight what English fever is. And the first symptom is early English education abroad. So as you can see in the picture, many young Korean kids, they're sent to English-speaking countries such as the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand to learn English at an early age. And it's because our parents believe that the earlier, the better for language learning. So every year, hundreds and thousands of children are sent abroad for English language learning. And the second example is about childbirth abroad. And that means that some Korean women, they purposely take flight to the US in their 3rd trimester to give birth to a baby on the American soil. It's because the US grants citizenship to anyone who's born on the American soil. So that's their strategy to secure a better future for their children in case a child wants to study in the US, and that way they can get us they will only need to pay domestic rate rather than an international rate. And the final example is a bit gruesome. It's called lingual phoneectomy or accent surgery. A lot of Koreans, they have trouble pronouncing L and R because R sound, it doesn't exist in the Korean alphabet. And so this surgery is started more than 10 years ago. There's some parents, they took their children to hospitals so that the children can have the surgery, and they believe that that way their tongue can get longer and nimbler, and that way they can pronounce R sound better. And so it peaked about 10 years ago, but even now it is still performed for the same reason. So English is undoubtedly, it's a global language. And there has been a lot of focus on the contemporary aspects of English in the relevant scholarship. But if we approach English only as a global language, it might risk overlooking local particularities that might have influenced the development of English in a particular local context. And so this presentation is going to raise this key question. So how has English been historically naturalized as a language of power in Korea? And I am going to approach this topic from a historical perspective through periodization. As you can see, the arrival of English in Korea in 1882 to English under Japanese colonization, and finally, American fever in post-independence Korea. And through this, I'll show English has served as valued capital tied to American hegemony in Korea. But first, what is capital? I'm going to draw inspiration from a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, and his theory of capital. And according to Bourdieu, if you look at society, it represents a field of competition. So individual actors, they compete against each other to acquire valued capital. And there are 4 types of capital. First, economic capital. It means money, financial assets, property, so anything that's convertible to money. And second is a social capital. That means one's networks of social groups such as family, friends, or if you belong to a particular body, like a political body, and the membership itself, it represents social capital. And symbolic capital then means an honor and prestige accorded to an individual. And finally, cultural capital, it means behavior or the way that individuals speak or institutional credentials. So in this presentation, you will learn that English, it represents all forms of capital that I have shown. So let's begin with the arrival of English in Korea in 1882. So English arrived in Korea in 1882 when the Joseon dynasty, which is Korea's predecessor, was under threat from its powerful neighbors, including Japan, China, and Russia in the 19th century. So as you can see in the drawing here, a yangban, a noble class man, a Korean man, is pulled in 3 different directions: China, Japan, and Korea. They wanted to, they were eyeing on Korea primarily because of its geopolitical location. So China, which had acted as Korea's elder brother for centuries, they wanted to curb Japanese ambitions. So they joined forces with the US, which resulted in the 1882 Korean-American Treaty, which is the first international treaty in Korea. And following the treaty, King Gojong, who was the king of Korea back then, he was absolutely dependent on the US and the American legation as a protector. And he saw the US as a generous benefactor. And it's described as you can see, literally like a child on his father. Now, why? And it's because of this clause relating to good offices. So good offices, that means that on being informed of the case or an emergency, to bring about an amicable agreement, thus showing their friendly feelings. And there was an interpretive difference between the king and the US, because King Gojong saw this as unflinching commitment from the US to protect Korea, whereas then American President Roosevelt, for him, it was just a mere legal phrase. But regardless of the difference, the king regarded the US as Korea's new elder brother and invited American advisors to the government. And the problem was that there was no Korean who could speak English back then. And this is how the first English education school, Dongmunhak, was established in 1883 in Korea. And the main purpose was to train English Korean translators and interpreters to assist American advisors on government matters. And what is really interesting about this school is the student selection. So students were selected through merit-based criteria. That means as long as one was linguistically talented, and that person was accepted regardless of his or her class background. So you might know that back then, Korea has a caste system. So there was a royal class and a noble class and middle class and the commoners. So transcending the class barrier was impossible. And so for commoners, becoming a translator and interpreter, it was a golden opportunity for them to actualize social mobility, because the translators and interpreters belong to the middle class, 중인. And although they belong to the middle class, not to the noble class, translators and interpreters were often extremely wealthy because they utilized their language skills to engage in trade, and that way they became extremely wealthy. And another route for Koreans to learn English was American mission schools, which came to Korea in the 19th century. And there was a lack of English speakers, although there was a growing demand for English speakers from Western diplomats and legations. So schools run by American missionaries, they were popular among commoners for the same region to transcend the class boundaries. And here is an excerpt from a diary kept by a well-known American missionary Appenzeller. And as you can see, the enthusiasm for the study of English has always been great. So ask a Korean, why do you wish to study English? And they would say, to get rank, to get a government job. So that means that English was a language of opportunity to actualize a social mobility for commoners who suffered under the caste system. And you might wonder, so how far could one go with English skills? And I'm going to show you one interesting example. And you are looking at two men, and the man on the left-hand side, Lee, he was a street rice cake vendor. Okay? And until he met Horace Allen, who was an American missionary in Korea. So Lee was hired as Allen's personal cook. And while he was working for Allen, and there was a medical emergency in the royal family. So one of the members got seriously sick, but nobody could treat him. And Allen, he was a medical doctor in the US, so he was brought in and he cured the royal member. And that earned him enormous trust from the king. But the king couldn't speak English, obviously. So they needed an interpreter. And so Lee acted as an interpreter for the king. And that way he got a government job, and later he got promoted to a foreign minister for Korea. And another influence on the popularity of English in Korea was media. And the Donglip Shinmun, or The Independent, was the first English Korea bilingual newspaper launched by Seo Jae-pil in 1896. And you are looking at his picture here, and Seo is a very interesting figure in Korea because he was the first Korean person who was naturalized as American. And so while he was in the US, so he was originally a part of a progressive political group in Korea, but he exiled in the US and became naturalized as American. And he came back to Korea to help Korea to develop, and the Independent is part of his efforts. And it's interesting because he held Orientalist view of Koreans as inferior others by establishing himself as a superior to Koreans. And he thought that Koreans needed solid guidance from the West for enlightenment. And these are some excerpts from The Independent, and I'm going to let you read to learn how the superior-inferior binary was established in The Independent. Right, I'm aware of the time limit. So as you can see, Seo said Koreans should eat beef and bread instead of kimchi and rice. And the US believes in loyalty and it's the best country in the world. And the US in Korean, it's Miguk. Miguk means beautiful country, right? So this really is an example of how, from the very beginning, beautified images and fantastic images were attached to the US. So English fever is not a recent phenomenon. And so as you can see in the photo, it says in Korean, 지금은 영어 inflation. That means the era of English inflation. And this newspaper was published more than 100 years ago. And there's increasing American influence on Korea. So as I have said, English was strongly associated with the power of the US and was recognized as language capital for ambitious Koreans to actualize social mobility. Let me now move on to the second phase, English under Japanese colonization from 1910 to 1945. And during the colonization, Japan established Oriental ethnography based on the survival of the fittest. And that means ethnic political groupings of Asian people. So Japan established itself as the most enlightened race in Asia. And Korea was, on the contrary, it was seen as the ethnical inferior. So this inculcated a strong inferiority complex in Koreans because of the colonized reality. They felt powerless. And so self-orientalism became very strong in Korean consciousness. And I'm going to highlight this with by taking some examples from new fictions or shinsoseol in Korean. And this is one of the requests from the audience, as far as I understand. So you are looking at popular novelist. I'm not sure if you know him. His name is Lee Kwang-soo, who wrote Mujang. Mujang means the heartless. That's the first long modern Korean novel. And Lee wrote a book called Ethnic Reconstruction. And in the book, he argued that Korean populace is nothing but inferior and weak. So he said that it's necessary to have sweeping reform of the national character with the West as a model of enlightenment. And then the US, the West means the US. The US was established as a model for enlightenment. So why? It is because of the phenomenon of American modernity under Japanese colonization. And American modernity refers to the phenomenon of Americanism, or the newly emerging social and cultural phenomena. And Koreans were keen to sever themselves from what they saw as the inferior past in order to regain the country. And for them, achieving modernization was the best way to achieve independence, and the US was a model to them. And among Korean intellectuals, American modernity that represented escapist Americacentrism, that means American books, movies, imported food products, they represented superior culture to Korean people. And by immersing themselves, by indulging themselves in American modernity, one could forget about the colonized reality. So in American modernity, the US was characterized by civilization, striking gold, liberation, and pioneering spirit. So what did English represent? And fluency in English, it was a signifier of colonial modernity among Korean elites. And the new fiction is a great example. In the new fiction, so new fiction, for those of you who are not familiar with it, that means that it's different from old forms of Korean literature. So they advocated freedom, individual freedom, free marriage, and a new society. And many protagonists in the new fiction, they were described as proficient in English. And going overseas, mostly to the US, for study, it was often the only solution for protagonists in crisis. And I'm going to take an example with the 혈의, which is roughly translated as blood rain, and which is the first new fiction in Korea. So in the novel, there is a male protagonist and a female protagonist. And the female protagonist's father, after having a lot of crises in Korea, he went to the US. Okay? And the female protagonist also went to the US for study. And the male protagonist and the female protagonist, when they first met, and the man, he spoke in English. And he said, oh, let's speak in English. In Korean, one has to use honorific expressions, and I don't feel it right. And because, as you know, in Korea, there's age hierarchy. So the younger person should use honorific expressions to an older person. But back then, women had to use honorific expressions to men. So he didn't like it. So he said, okay, let's speak in English because it's gender neutral. And also he said, we'll be like Westerners about marriage. We'll decide on our own rather than following parental order if we want to marry. And what this shows is that English represented a signifier of colonial modernity among Korean intellectuals. And English served as cultural and symbolic capital too. And I'm going to show this with Mujang, the Heartless, the novel that I just mentioned as an example. And this is an excerpt from the novel. And in the novel, Sun Hyung, she's the female protagonist, and her sister, they studied English because their father wanted to send them to the US for study. And so she received English tutoring from Hyung-sik, a middle school English teacher. And as you can see, she had these fantastic images about the US. And she thought that through English, it became a sign of their enhanced state of intelligence. And she felt so proud. And so she imagined herself wearing Western outfit and with a Western hat on and talking freely in English to American girls around her age. So what this shows is that English, it meant cultural and symbolic capital tied to class distinction. But what I have shown so far, it was rather limited to Korean intellectuals, this particular group, elite group. Then how did English become popular or popularized in Korea? It's because of the political situation, and it began with the division of Korea in 1945. And as you know, the Second World War, it was ended with the US bombing Hiroshima. And Korea achieved independence because of that too, because Japan had to pull out of Korea. So the independence was naturalized as a gift from the US for Koreans. And America was a kind of a father who gave birth to a new Korea. So the phenomenon of pro-America or Sungmi worship the US, it began around the independence. So whatever was American was Western, therefore universal for Koreans. So this period is, in my book, I defined it as post-colonial coloniality. That means that the former Japanese rule was simply replaced by the US. So technically speaking, Korea was freed, but in reality, not really. So the post-liberation era of Korea, it represents a watershed in planting the seed for English fever, and I'm going to show you how. So between 1945, right after the liberation, and 1948, the American military government was established in Korea to help the transition from the Japanese rule to help Korea to become independent. And during this period, English was established as an official language along with Korean, which is very interesting because growing up in Korea, I never learned this. I'm a history major, but I never learned this. And as you can imagine, there was zero American officer who could speak Korean. And there were some American officers who were fluent in Japanese, but Korean people who were so anti-Japan after the colonization, they refused to collaborate with Japanese-speaking American officers. So they had to hire English-Korean interpreters. So what was the status of English in Korea? You are looking at an excerpt from the book, The Origin of the Korean War by Cummings. And as you can see, when Americans first came to Korea, they couldn't tell who's who. and who's their friend and who's their enemy. And how, as you can see, how are we to know, who is who among unfamiliar people? So for practical purposes, we had to hire persons who spoke English, and it so happened that their persons and their friends came largely from moneyed classes, because English had been a luxury among Koreans. So under the colonization, learning a foreign language was a luxury for most people who were busy eking out day-to-day life. So only a certain group of people from moneyed classes, they could learn English. And as is now, many of the privileged, they are conservative. So that means that they were pro-Japanese and conservative. And with Americans arriving, those pro-Japanese people, they became pro-American to maintain their social status. And so interpreters working for the military government, they came from that conservative background. So the job was highly popular among educated and conservative Koreans because it was an opportunity to access power. And American officers absolutely relied on interpreters. So much so that it was called interpreters government, or 통역정부. And those interpreters, they distorted meanings in their own favor, and they profited from corruptions and irregularities, and recommended particular people in exchange for bribes, and influenced political decisions according to their political orientation. So for the MG interpreters, English represented economic and political capital. And I'm going to show you one final example to highlight English as political capital in Korea. And you are looking at the first Korean president, Seungman Lee. And Lee and English were inseparable because Lee was from the Yangban class, but he was politically intuitive, and he saw the rise of the US and the decline of China and saw opportunities in English. So he went to mission school to learn English. And while studying there, and after finishing studying, he worked there as a teacher. And while working with American missionaries, he developed admiration of the US. So Lee's dedication to English language learning is well demonstrated by the fact that when he was jailed for political activities, and he studied English by memorizing a pocket dictionary and magazines in English. So what did the US and English mean to Lee? And here are two excerpts from his autobiography, and I'm going to let you read. So those parts that are highlighted, I highlighted, okay, not Lee. So the great ambition which led me to the mission school was to learn English only. And in the era of the interrelationship of peoples, Seungman Lee belongs to America and to the entire free world. So you can see how much he idealized the US and English language learning. So Lee was educated in the US. He got his bachelor's degree, the master's degree, and he finished his PhD at Princeton. And with this, he became the first Korean who earned a PhD overseas. And after finishing his PhD, he lived in the US for 30 years, and that gave him an enormous opportunity to build a political network with Washington. And when Korea was liberated, Lee came back to Korea, backed by the military government, because he was an ultra-conservative and anti-communist. So for the military government, Lee was an effective response to communist threat from North Korea and Russia. And so you're looking at two different photos, and the right-hand side is Lee, and the left-hand side is Kim Gu, who was Lee's political rival. And Lee could speak English, but Kim couldn't. That means that Lee had an enormous advantage in terms of building networks with Americans and the military government. And Kim, unfortunately, he got assassinated before the presidential election. But we can hypothesize that if Kim had been fluent in English and Lee hadn't been, then maybe the Korean history, it might have changed. So after Lee became the president, Korea, the new country, it was established with the US as a model. Korea's education system is exactly similar, exactly the same as that of the US. And the political systems and the separation of power, it was all modeled, and the president's system, it was all modeled on those of the US. And moreover, Lee favored people who were fluent in English. So he hired people who could speak English well as ministers and in important government positions. So the second president of Korea, Yoon Bo-sun, he also had overseas experiences. He studied in Edinburgh. So that means the power of English in Korean politics and the continued power of English in higher education in Korea. So American degrees, they dominate in Korean politics. And for example, in higher education, English and American degrees, so most professors in Korea, they have American degrees, and English and American degrees, they have served as academic capital for Korean people, for Korean higher education. So there is distinction between domestic and overseas educated factions. In Korean, it says 해외파 and 국내파. Now, these terms, they refer to people who have learned English overseas versus at home. So English fever, it's a phenomenon deeply embedded in historicity, and the evolution of English as valid language capital is inseparable from the cultural, economic, and political influence of the US. So in conclusion, there are multiple ideologies attached to English. As I said, when English first arrived in Korea, it was a mobility enabler for commoners. And during the Japanese colonization, English served as a cultural capital and symbolic capital. And during the American military government, English was economic capital for interpreters and political capital, as we have seen in the case of Seungman Lee, and social capital. Seungman Lee could build his political network with English as a key tool. And what about now? Well, English is still, it has multiple meanings for Koreans. It's a tool for distinction. And it's also an instrument to achieve cosmopolitan ideals and neoliberal personhood and academic capital, as I have said. And it's a key tool for competitiveness. Without English, it's almost impossible to get a white-collar job in Korea because it is compulsory to present official English language scores for white-collar jobs for Koreans. And it's also embodied capital. And I explored this concept in another work about English-Korean interpreters against the phenomenon of beautiful interpreters. Right. So English represents master's language for Koreans who are so used to superior-inferior binary. So American hegemony has turned English into a powerful tool in Korean consciousness. And English has always been a superior language, as influenced by the binary logic between Korea and the US. And I said at the beginning of the presentation that the English as a global language, yes, that's true, but this macro approach, it may risk overlooking local particularities. So it's important to have a deeper examination of English language ideologies from local historical perspectives. And if you want to know more, then here's my book, English Language Ideologies in Korea. And this is the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jinhyun Cho, for such a fascinating talk. I learned so much today, and has definitely my view about the field has been extended. And I'm pretty sure everyone in this room would feel the same with me. So let's all give Dr. Jinhyun Cho one round of applause once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to open a floor to questions now. But while you are thinking about your questions, can I quickly advertise about our next talk, which is going to take place next month with Dr. Joanna, who is postdoctoral fellow from Harvard University. She will talk about K-pop fandom in Mexico on the 28th of April. So I'm pretty sure this will be another fascinating topic to explore. So please keep an eye on it as the advertisement will be released close to date. Okay, right. I'd like to open it up for questions now. Are there any questions for Dr. Jinhyun Cho's presentation today? So please raise your hands if you do. Yep, there you go. Introduce name.
Thanks very much, Dr. Cho. A fascinating talk. It's really interesting. And I was an English teacher for a long time in Korea, and it was very frustrating hearing from students, well, I don't want to learn your British English, I want to learn American English. I've got that all the time. It's quite interesting. But I've got a quick question, and I wonder, because you didn't really talk about, it was fascinating historical background to the growth of English that you gave, but one part you didn't really talk about is how that's been, that sort of American hegemony has been sort of challenged after Gwangju, the Gwangju uprising. And I wonder, in what ways has this sort of putting American English on a pedestal been challenged after Gwangju? In what ways has this sort of been expressed? And this idea of cultural capital and educational and social capital and all the rest of it. I wonder if you could just very briefly say a couple of things about that.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. That's a very good question, because what I presented today is a certain aspect of English in Korea's historical periodization, but it can't, of course, cover every aspect of the U.S. and English in Korean history. About the Gwangju democratic movement, I mean, that was that sparked anti-American sentiment in Korea. And so what's really fascinating about the US and English in Korea is that there's this mixture of idealizing the US and also an anti the US. So the same country, but polarized. But back then, it was largely because of the military dictatorship. It wasn't so much to do with the US and its power, although the Chun government, it was backed by the US. So for the citizens, if your question is about the Gwangju democratic movement, it was against the military government and not so much against the US, but although they were collaborators back then. So this phenomenon, how could we grapple with the fact that anti-America and worship the US and how they can coexist? And it is something that a lot of scholars have tried to understand. But if you look at individual levels, and regardless of their political orientation, and English has been established as the key capital for anyone who wants to get a white collar job, or who wants to achieve social mobility, and who wants to progress socially, then it is essential to learn English and also earn those cultural capital through sojourning to the US or through their network with the US. So it's a good question, but all I can say is that there's this mixture of anti-American feelings and versus the other, they're worshiping the US, but it's something that requires more study.
Mm. In such small countries, there are always the people who strongly express very opposite opinions. I think it's quite interesting country, not because I'm from Korea. It is in general. Thank you. Okay, Stefan from New Zealand, if I remember correctly.
That's correct.
Yeah,
And hello.
come on, thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, no, thank you very much for your talk. And actually, Andy was already leading in the direction I wanted to go, is just following up on certainly historically, the importance of American hegemony for the place of English in Korea is crucial. But from the perspective of 2022, when you talk about, for example, cosmopolitan capital, I'm just wondering how critical Andy's experience aside, and the fact that people still want to have an American accent, which I haven't purged myself of in 27 years here in Australasia, but the fact, in fact, it's precisely moving here to Australasia and thinking about the numbers of Australians and New Zealanders who are teaching English in Korea, and just looking at what's happened with English in the last 20 years, where even, say, in the EU, its progress is a result of the European Union, where people want to converse with each other because it's now kind of, it has become, I see it much more as a neutral global language rather than an instrument of specifically American influence. So ideology 2022 for Korean English and America, what would you say?
Yes, I think, I mean, now, if you look at 2022, the picture is definitely different from what I presented. But I think we can only understand the present by understanding the past. So if you look at the past, the huge influence of the US, and in the presentation, I presented only up to 1960, because of the time limitation. But in my research, I did I traced the development of English in Korea up to the 21st century. So there's a lot more than I presented. But in terms of the popularity of English, it peaked since the 1997 Asian financial crisis in Korea. So in terms of how it became a key capital for Koreans, you have to understand that the logic of competitiveness in Korea is so strong that everybody has to arm themselves with the individual competitiveness. So English became even stronger after the financial crisis, because as you know, and after the financial crisis, the country went bankrupt, and so many large conglomerates went bankrupt, and so that way English acquired more meaning. So as history goes on, and this is like so whether English loses the previous ideologies and acquires new ideologies, or whether new ideologies are attached to the existing ideologies. And this is something that we need to think about.
So can I have a follow-up? Then how does that relate to, for example, like Koreans being by far the greatest students in like the 2000s, that decade of Chinese within China, like the Chungugo Yaopeng? How does that relate to, because in addition to English fever increasing, you've got Chinese fever increasing. Is it just that Koreans as a small country wanting to be globally competitive are particularly instrumentalist in their language ideologies, or?
I think it's a good question, Stephen. But I think it's also to do with the competitiveness, because English was regarded as a key tool for competitiveness, but now it's a default language. That means that everybody is expected to be fluent in English or has English language skills for employment. If you look at the job market, and so because people are become better with English language skills, then they need distinction. So that means that the bar to measure good English, it keeps going up. So it used to be like, if you are familiar with the official English language test, TOEIC, in my era, when I was a uni student, if somebody got TOEIC over 800, then everybody thought, wow, well, you're really good. But now it became 900. And now there are so many people who get full marks for TOEIC. So getting full marks for TOEIC is not surprising anymore. So what can one do because English has become so important? Now everybody is expected to be good at English. Then you have to acquire something else. And the Chinese happen to be, because China, because of its political and economic power, and Korea's geopolitical and economic relationships with China. So it's not that Chinese has replaced the English.
No.
Yes.
I certainly didn't want to suggest that, but just that it's interesting that Koreans have the English language fever, but also are at least in the 2000s, were #1 in study of Chinese within China too. Thanks.
That's like, looking at the example that Dr. Jinhyun Cho shared, the rice cake maker, Lee Ha-young. I felt like I should have been born earlier than maybe. But with my degrees in Australia, well, in Korea, I don't think it's nothing that much special at this time. So I was very jealous of it.
If you had been born in Korea back then, so unfortunately, I don't think you would have got an opportunity to be hired as a cook for a man. You might have used English for some other purposes, like because of time limitations, I couldn't talk about this phenomenon of new women under Japanese colonization. That means that English, just briefly speaking, English represented a tool for women were highly oppressed in Korea in those days. So it was a tool for liberation for them, by speaking English and understanding American modernity. And they wanted to become feminists, and they wanted to become modern women or new women. So it's very fascinating from gender perspective.
It is. Oh my God, I feel like there's so many to explore. Okay, is there anyone else who would like to have the question? If you're feeling too shy, you can throw your question to chat room. Actually, Dr. Jinhyun Cho, Sam Lee asked, is there any way we can contact Dr. Jinhyun if we want to speak to her more about the topic? Would you like them to contact you directly through your email address if they want to ask you questions?
My email address is publicly available. So if you go to Google and type in my name, you can get it. So it's not something that I can control. Not that I'm saying that you shouldn't, okay? I'm not discouraging you, but if you go there, then you can find it.
Okay. Did you hear that, Sam Lee? You can Google Jinhyun Cho and plus Macquarie University, Sydney. Her email address is actually there. That's how I contacted her as well. So, yes.
Yes, Sam. Oh, you got it. All right.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Anyone has a question? Because I think we can only have one more question to ask. Oh, yes, Lucien 교수님. This is the first time he asks questions ever throughout the seminar series, Dr. Jinhyun Cho.
Oh, I'm honored.
Sure, not the first time, but yeah, I do like to let other people have a go, but I saved mine. I just wanted to ask, thank you for the presentation. It was really fascinating to hear the kind of historical background of English fever. Towards the end of your presentation, when you were mentioning kind of social meanings of English in Korea today, you mentioned embodied capital. I just wondered what you meant by embodied capital in this context.
Yeah, thank you, Lucian. That's a good question. So I said that I explored the concept in my other work about beautiful interpreters in Korea, and there was a phenomenon of beautiful interpreters in Korea about 10 years ago, and that means that the interpreters engaged in the field of sports who serve foreign athletes in Korea, and they got caught in media and during televised matches. So, and then there was this one interpreter who was very pretty, and she became popular after that. And then it led to more beautiful interpreters. So it was a highly mediatized event, but it attracted my attention because I was working on my PhD, and I was thinking, oh, okay, this is something very different. So I drew inspiration from Bourdieu's concept of embodied capital. And that means that when one speaks language, and not all speech is equal. That means that the person who speaks with the right accent or with the socially sanctioned manners, or embodied properties, the way that we were brought up by our parents about how to speak and whatnot. So they all constitute and determine one's ability to produce embodied capital. So speech is, in a way, it's embodied and it's inseparable from us. So what I argued in the article was that, so the article is titled, "Why Do Interpreters Beautiful?" So what I argued was that it's the same as what I just mentioned to Stephen's question. So the bar to measure good English in Korea, it keeps going up, and it's the same to interpreters. So interpreters in Korea and English interpreters, they were very popular and they earned a lot of money, and they were sought after around the 2000s and at the beginning of the 2000s. But as there were more interpreting schools and there were more interpreters in the market, they needed something else to distinguish themselves. And appearance, that's where appearance came in, one's aesthetics. And so this is also to do with the gender. So if you look at interpreters and language workers, a lot of them are females, and because they serve men in powerful positions. So a man in powerful position, they naturally prefer someone on the condition that everybody speaks good English. They would choose someone who is more beautiful than the others. So that way, English serves as embodied capital in Korea.
Wow, so interesting. Did they answer to your question, Dr. Lucian? Okay, well, the 2 days scheduled time is up.
I think there's another person who has a question.
So I was going to ask you, for anyone who is in a hurry, you can please leave. But I was going to ask you, Dr. Jinhyun, if you mind answering one more question for Karen.
No, not at all. It's okay.
Okay. If anyone else, you are in a hurry, you can leave, please. But if you feel free to stay for this question, do so. Okay, Karen, what is your question? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Cho. It's a wonderful talk, and I always enjoy your work. I wanted to ask you a really quick question. I'm curious to what degree you see a bit of a generational divide and also a class divide in terms of approaches toward English as being, viewed either in terms of kind of the American dream and influence of the United States versus the very important domestic function that English plays. If you could just, talk about that very briefly. And also just to shamelessly self-promote, in graduate school, I published an article on thinking about the rising bar in Mandarin in Korea. Just
right.
to put that out there.
Right.
Anyway, thank you very much. And I'd like to hear, and I know some of this is, I know the focus has been on the history part of it. So I'm not trying to, I know you talk about other work about the later period, but I'm just curious because historically then the older generation definitely does have this attachment more towards the US.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. That's a good question. Remember if the photos that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, the Korean flag and the American flag, those ultra conservative elderly people in Korea. So it's a group of politically minded elderly people in Korea, and who, whenever they go to rallies, they go there with the Korean flag and the US flag. And then why do they do that? Because of old elderly people, and because of the history that they went through, and they lived the hegemony, the American hegemony, and when they were, when they're very little. So they, for them, it was so natural to see, not to worship, but it's so natural that anything made in the US, it was better than Korea. In Korean, there's this expression, 미제. 미제 means made in the US. And the people used to say that 미제 is the best. Okay, anything in the, it's made in the US is the best. So for them, it's just so natural. And also, as I said, in the post-liberation era, the US was naturalized as Korea's benefactor, and who liberated Korea. So all those ideologies attached to the US and English, and they have influenced their attitudes, positive attitudes to the US. And also, this is the generation that lives through the anti-communist era. And the inter-Korean relationships now, they're much better than before. But when I was little, North Korea and North Koreans, they were not even human beings. And I remember that in animations, they were described as sheep, North Koreans, and North Korean leader, they were like a wolf or some other animals. So these people, they lived through that era, and the idea of the superiority of the US and the US as Korea's protector, it had become internalized in them. So that's the kind of mentality that they have. Whereas for the younger generation, I don't think the US has as strong meanings as the old people have. However, for them, it is to certain degrees so natural to go to the US for studies rather than going to Australia, for example. And it's so natural for them to learn American English rather than Australian accent, for example. So for them, of course, English is a main tool for employment, economic capital, but at the same time, it's cultural capital for them too. Okay, if somebody has studied in the US and being able to speak with fluent American accent, and that person will be seen superior to others. So it's something that's more explicit among older Koreans, but it's also, among young people, the subconsciously, or consciously or subconsciously, they also live under American influence. About class, and English has always served as a class marker in Korea. And that doesn't mean that people who can't speak English, they will be looked down upon. But if you can speak English well, and if you have reasonable amount of wealth, then that will then people would see you in high regard. So it's something that's inseparable from class. And to understand this, it's necessary to understand why sojourning to the US is so popular, and why people want to learn English, and how it's tied to American hegemony. I hope that has answered your question.
Did it? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking because I won't take any more time. Okay, thank you so much.
You can email her. Her email address is in public. Thank you so much, Dr. Cho. Dr. Jinhyun Cho, once again, we look forward to more of your work in the future and hope to see you again here. Okay, I would like to remind that if you're from Monash University Korean Studies Project members, if your time is allowed, please stay a bit longer. So we're going to talk about our research with Dr. Jinhyun Cho. For our external members, now today's event is up, so you can leave now. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.